I just want to start by asking you about this ceasefire that has been announced by US President Donald Trump and accepted by Iran. How crucial is this ceasefire?
Well, thank you so much for having me, first of all. I mean, this is a really important step and it's a really welcome step. I mean, this has, this war over a month now has had huge impact on people living in the Middle East, in Iran, in Lebanon, in the Gulf. I mean, you've seen casualties and displacement and people killed and wounded. So obviously, this is a huge respite for people living in the region. And I wanted to mention that first and foremost. From a strategic perspective, I'd like to just temper the news a little bit by stating that this is a temporary ceasefire and the core issues between the US, Israel, and Iran have not yet been addressed. And in fact, the two sides, when you look at their core demands, still are quite far away from each other. So the first step is this ceasefire just to stop the violence and to turn down the temperature, to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, which will be a huge relief to global markets, of course, and ordinary households all over the world who've been affected by this. But the real work starts now. The two parties are set to be meeting in Pakistan on Friday, and we will see how the discussions will go from there.
Ma'am, you also mentioned this is just a first step. I want to understand from you how fragile is this? Because the 10 points given by Iran, US President Trump has said that it is workable, the points are workable, but the demands are very maximalist. There is a mention of uranium enrichment. There is a mention of that US bases should not be there in the region. How do you see and how tough the negotiation are going to be?
It's a very good question, and you used exactly the right word, maximalist. It is perfectly normal at the beginning of a negotiation, especially when both sides feel that they are coming out of this victorious. You know, Iran has been able to withstand US and Israeli attacks, it's been able to keep the Strait of Hormuz closed, it's even been able to charge a fee for letting certain countries pass through. And so it feels empowered. And so it will be maximalist in its demands, but that's perfectly normal. That's the way negotiations start. That's why I'm saying this is a starting point and the real hard work begins now. Both sides, and I've been saying this for a while now, that when this conflict ends, both sides are going to have to make concessions on their part. Iran is not going to likely be allowed to maintain full control of the strait. At the same time, it won't get its demands of the US removing all its bases from the Middle East. The US may or may not get its full demand of zero enrichment. It may look like a different formula. So these are all the issues that are going to be discussed. One thing I hope that both parties will learn, but particularly the United States, based on past negotiations and what's happened in the last month plus, is that the US also can no longer impose and expect its own maximalist demands to be placed on the table, that the US will also have to make concessions. One thing that this war so far has revealed are the limits of US military power and US hard power, and that hard power alone can't get the US what it wants. And in fact, it could contribute to the destabilization of the entire global economy. So I hope that's a lesson that US negotiators are taking into account. And one thing I'll say is the fact that it's potentially J.D. Vance, the vice president, that's going into these talks in Pakistan on Friday could mean that there's a bit of a different approach from the previous mediators, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, who have been involved in negotiations in the past.
Ma'am, now the question is about Israel. Do you think Israel was kept in dark about these negotiations, about these mediation that has happened? Because nowhere in the statements Israel was mentioned. Though there was a mention of Lebanon that there will not be any operation in Lebanon, but that has also been rejected by Israeli Prime Minister. He has said that we will continue the operation. How do you see Israel position at this point of time, and what is in it for Israel?
Well, thank you. That's an excellent question because one thing I've also been saying for the last couple of weeks, if not more, is that there will come a point in this war when US interests and Israeli interests begin to diverge. That from the beginning, those interests may have been overlapping in some ways, but were not exactly 100% overlapping. The things that Israel wants out of the region are not the things that the US necessarily wants out of the region. Just as an example, this Israeli government would prefer, and as they have stated themselves, for the for the countries in the region around them to be weak. They've said that about Syria, they've said that about Lebanon, and certainly Iran. And so that is not in the interest of the United States. A weak and fragile Middle East is more prone to instability. It's more prone to non-state actor / terrorist activity, extremism. So these are not things that are good for the US or its allies. So you've hit the nail on the head, really, with this question, which is what happens with Israel now that the US and Iran are going to be engaging into these talks? Already, Israel said that the ceasefire doesn't apply to Lebanon, so we'll have to wait and see what kind of pressure the US puts on Prime Minister Netanyahu to stop the attacks on Lebanon. He may or may not listen, so that's one thing we'll watch out for. And also just in terms of long-term strategy, whether Israel will continue to seek regime change in Iran, which is Prime Minister Netanyahu's stated goal, or whether it will fall in line with the US and accept an Iranian regime that stays in place but tries to limit its activities and attacks against Israel.
Ma'am, I also want to understand from you what is the future of Gulf countries here. There has been they were under attacks and they suffered a lot. They have there is a lacuna here of trust. Basically, there is a deficit of trust between Iran and these Gulf countries. Going forward, what kind of agreements are you seeing in the future between Gulf countries and Iran and between Gulf countries and US, ma'am?
Yeah, well, listen, I mean, you're asking all the right questions. I mean, the Gulf countries really suffered greatly from this war between Israel, Iran, and the US. First of all, they did not want this war. They were trying desperately to get President Trump not to go to war with Iran, precisely because they were worried about the consequences. But I think even they did not expect Iran to go as far as it did in terms of hitting critical energy infrastructure, civilian infrastructure in the Gulf. It has broken, I don't want to say bonds of trust because there was never really trust between Iran and the Gulf countries, but there was at least an understanding. There was a détente between Saudi Arabia and Iran, brokered by the Chinese. There were trade agreements and cooperation between the UAE and Iran, for example, maritime agreements. So there was a kind of understanding that collective security in the region was in the interest of all parties. And they feel that Iran has completely broken that pact and attacked them in a way that is simply unacceptable for them and that will be very hard for Iran to recover from. So that's why you see reports of Gulf countries asking the US to make sure, even though, again, they did not want this war, but to make sure that at least if the war ends, please make sure that it ends in a way where Iran is not essentially holding us hostage in this region, that it's not able to close the Strait of Hormuz at a whim, that it's not able to attack the Gulf, or that at least it knows there will be a higher cost imposed on it for attacking Gulf countries in the future, and so on. And so that's what the Gulf countries are going to be looking for. They're going to be in contact with the US mediators and other mediators, Egypt, Pakistan, Turkey, Oman, to make sure that the final arrangement, if there is a final arrangement, because remember, none of this is guaranteed, but if there is a final arrangement, that it includes guarantees of future Gulf security baked into that final agreement.
And then what about the future of Strait of Hormuz? We have seen how fragile it is. Uh, Iran can close it at a whim. So what, according to you, will happen now Will there be an alternate waterways that are being considered? And according to you, because Iran has shown that it wants to control it permanently and it wants to impose toll also, so to say. What is the future from here for the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, that obviously is going to be unacceptable for the US and also not an ideal situation for any country for any one country to have total control over global shipping and as a result, global markets is not a workable solution. So you are going to see multiple parties at the table trying to come up to a workable solution that evokes collective security of the strait. How that happens, remains to be seen. Oman has been already in talks with Iran to start talking about potential solutions for this, where Iran feels it's okay with it, but also other countries feel as well. Iran also, through the Houthis, Ansar Allah in Yemen, has effective potential control over Bab el-Mandeb, which goes into the Red Sea, which is an alternative shipping route. And then, of course, you have the Suez Canal and the Cape of Good Hope down in south. So there are multiple shipping routes, but of course, the main one, that's one of the main ones, if not the main one that's being used, is the Strait of Hormuz. So that's why I think you will start to see negotiations over what a kind of global collective responsibility around that strait looks like. They're not going to be easy conversations because Iran feels like it has proven that it can control the strait and nobody can really do anything about it without imposing a very high cost on them. But we'll see how the negotiations go.
Ma'am, at last, I want to ask you one very simple yet very difficult question. Who has won this war? Because White House is saying we have won because Trump has said that within 6 weeks this war will be over. We have completed. The U.S. administration is saying that we have completed this war in 6 weeks. But according to you, who is the actual winner in this war?
You know, you're right. On one hand, it's a simple question, but on the other hand, it's not. It depends on how you define victory. It depends on every country's objectives going into this war. The US started this war in the middle of negotiations with Iran. And so the bar is much higher for them in order to be able to declare victory. The US, when it first started, before this war started, the Strait of Hormuz was open. And now it's negotiating to open the Strait of Hormuz. So it actually worked backwards in a sense and is now trying to get back to where it was in the beginning. So it's very hard to call that a victory. It's difficult. On the other hand, from a purely military perspective, it has weakened Iran's ballistic missile program. It has weakened Iran economically, but not to the point where it has destroyed, the regime infrastructure. Yes, it killed the Ayatollah Khamenei. He was very old anyway. He was probably not going to be around for much longer. His son is now in power. His son may be incapacitated based on certain reports. But even if his son also is killed, there will be another person to take his place. So the regime as a structure has not been eliminated, although it has been weakened. Proxies are still, again, weakened, like we talked about earlier, not completely defeated. Again, Ansar Allah or the Houthis in Yemen remain very active and capable of inflicting great cost. They chose not to get too involved so far in the war. They came in towards the very end, but that doesn't mean that they don't have the capacity to do so. And of course, Hezbollah in Lebanon is not completely defeated either. So it is going to be difficult for President Trump to declare victory over this, because Iran was the one attacked and came out of it as a survivor, and not only a survivor, as someone who was able to extract costs from this and impose costs, it will be easier for them objectively to declare victory But again, I keep coming back to the fact that we are just at the beginning of this next phase. We could be right back here where we started in 2 weeks. So I would just temper expectations about talking about any final verdicts. I think we're at the beginning of a very difficult period of negotiations. We don't know if the ceasefire will hold in the next 2 years. And so I want to be just very cautious about the phase that we're entering into.